Jackson's eyes snapped open to the hum of dying life support systems. The abandoned Terran frigate Nightfall had been his refuge for 3 days now, drifting in the neutral zone between human and Valdorian space. As a salvager, he'd seen worse places to sleep, though the flickering emergency lights and the occasional groan of buckling metal made it far from comfortable. But something was different, something warm pressed against his chest. He looked down and froze. A woman lay in his arms, her breathing shallow, her skin pale as moonlight. She wore ceremonial armor that gleamed even in the dim red glow of the emergency lights, intricate plates of silver and gold that no human forge had ever produced. Her hair, dark as the void itself, spilled across his makeshift bedroll like a cascade of silk. Jackson's heart hammered. He recognized those markings on her armor. Everyone in the galaxy did. This was Empress Elizabeth Vasval, ruler of the Valdorian Empire, supreme commander of 600 star systems, and humanity's greatest adversary in the decade-long war that had only ended 3 months ago with an uneasy truce. And she was unconscious in his arms. Jackson carefully extracted himself, his mind racing. How had she gotten here? The Nightfall had been abandoned for weeks, left adrift after a skirmish near the border. He had checked every compartment when he'd boarded. There had been no one else alive on the ship. He grabbed a scanner and ran it over her. The readings made his blood run cold. Radiation poisoning, severe dehydration, and something else. A biotoxin he didn't recognize. Whatever had happened to her, she was dying. The logical part of Jackson's brain screamed at him. This was the Empress, the woman who had ordered the bombardment of New Terror, the leader who had refused every peace offering until humanity had bloodied her fleet so badly that she had no choice but to accept a truce. He could leave her here, let the universe settle its own accounts. But Jackson had been a medic before he'd become a salvager, before the war had taken everything from him. Old instincts died hard. He scooped her up, surprisingly light despite the armor, and carried her to the medbay. The medical systems were barely functional, running on emergency reserves, but they would have to do. As he worked, injecting her with broad-spectrum antivirals and pumping fluids into her system, he couldn't help but wonder what series of catastrophes had led the most powerful woman in the galaxy to this abandoned human ship. Hours passed. Jackson monitored her vital signs, watching them slowly stabilize. He had seen soldiers recover from worse, but she wasn't out of danger yet. The biotoxin was stubborn, resisting every countermeasure he threw at it. As dawn broke, or what passed for dawn in the perpetual twilight of space, Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open. They were violet. Jackson realized they were inhuman and mesmerizing, like twin nebulae compressed into a woman's gaze. "You," she whispered. Her voice was weak yet regal. She spoke perfect Terran standard, though with an accent that made even ordinary words sound noble. "You are human." "Yeah," Jackson replied, keeping his distance. "And you're the Empress, which makes this the weirdest morning I've had in a while." She tried to sit up but fell back with a grimace. "Where am I?" "An abandoned Terran frigate, in the middle of nowhere. I found you about 6 hours ago in my sleeping area. No idea how you got there." Elizabeth's eyes widened. A flicker of something crossed her face. "The assassination attempt," she whispered. "They used a void jumper. I remember falling through space-time. The device malfunctioned. I must have been thrown across the systems at random." "Well," Jackson said dryly, "you landed in my arms. Lucky you. Most humans would have spaced you. Yet you saved me. It wasn't a question." She studied him with those impossible violet eyes. "Why?" Jackson shrugged, uncomfortable under her gaze. "Because leaving someone to die isn't what humans do. At least not the good ones. Anyway, I have killed thousands of your people." "Yeah," Jackson replied, "and I've killed hundreds of yours. The war is over now, though." He looked at her for a moment. "Or are we still fighting?" Elizabeth remained silent for a long moment. Then, impossibly, she laughed. It sounded like crystal bells shattering. "No," she said at last. "We are not fighting. Though my council would consider it treason that I am grateful to a human salvager for saving my life. Jackson smiled faintly. Guess we'll keep it our little secret, then. Over the next 2 days, as the nightfall continued its lonely drift through space, Jackson nursed Elizabeth back to health. They talked carefully at first, then with growing ease. She told him about the factions within her empire that wanted the war to continue. She explained the assassination plot that had nearly succeeded. He told her about new terror, about the family he had lost, and about the bitter taste of survival. Your species is remarkable, Elizabeth said on the second night as they shared rations in the dimly lit medbay. We thought you were simply aggressive, warlike, but that's not it, is it? You're survivors. You adapt. You endure. HFY, Jackson said. What? It's something soldiers used to say. Humanity, fuck yeah. He gave a small shrug. Stupid motto, but it kept people fighting when everything seemed lost. Elizabeth smiled. A real smile. Not the carefully practiced diplomatic expression he had seen in countless broadcasts. Perhaps, she said softly, it's not so stupid. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence shared between two people who had survived the same war from opposite sides. Jackson found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. Without the weight of imperial ceremony, she seemed surprisingly ordinary. She still carried herself with unmistakable authority, but there was exhaustion beneath it, hidden behind years of discipline. Elizabeth, in turn, watched him with quiet curiosity. You still don't trust me, she finally observed. Jackson let out a quiet laugh. Should I? No. Then we're being honest. She nodded. That is refreshing. The funny thing is, Jackson said, leaning back against the wall, before all this, I imagined you'd be 10 feet tall, breathing fire, and plotting humanity's extinction every second of the day. Elizabeth actually laughed. So that's what your propaganda said about me? Pretty much. And ours claimed every human child was trained from birth to become a soldier. Jackson raised an eyebrow. I spent my childhood falling out of trees and getting yelled at by my mother. Elizabeth smiled again. It seems both governments were rather creative. The conversation drifted from politics to history, then from history to culture. They discovered that despite decades of war, their civilizations shared far more similarities than either side had ever admitted. Both honored sacrifice. Both celebrated family. Both feared losing everything they loved. It was a realization neither of them had expected. Several times, Jackson caught himself forgetting who she really was. Then he'd notice the imperial insignia resting beside her armor, and reality would return. She wasn't simply Elizabeth. She was the Empress, the woman responsible for commanding one of the largest empires in known space. And somehow, she was sitting across from him, eating emergency ration bars and discussing terrible military coffee. You know, Jackson said, for someone who rules 600 star systems, you're surprisingly normal. Elizabeth tilted her head. I shall choose to interpret that as a compliment. It was. She looked down at the untouched ration pack in her hands. I haven't been normal in a very long time. For the first time since she had awakened, Jackson heard genuine sadness in her voice. An empress belongs to everyone, she said quietly, but almost never to herself. Jackson didn't know how to answer that, so he simply sat beside her in silence. Sometimes he realized silence was enough. When her rescue ship arrived on the third day, summoned by a beacon Jackson had helped her repair, Elizabeth stood at the airlock. Her armor had been cleaned, and her bearing was once again unmistakably imperial. Yet when she looked back at Jackson, there was something in her eyes that might have been regret. Come with me, she said suddenly. Be my advisor. Help me build a real peace. Jackson shook his head. I'm a salvager, Your Majesty. I pick through wreckage. I'm not exactly diplomatic material. You saved an enemy's life when you could have taken revenge, Elizabeth replied. That is the most diplomatic act I can imagine. Jackson smiled. Maybe someday, but I've got a feeling the galaxy isn't quite ready for a human in the Valdorian court. Elizabeth nodded, understanding. Perhaps not. Before she stepped through the airlock, she reached into a compartment in her armor and removed a small medallion bearing the Imperial seal. She pressed it into Jackson's hand. "If you ever need anything," she said softly. "Anything at all." Their eyes met for a brief moment. No more words were necessary. Jackson watched as she boarded the shuttle. The hatch sealed with a quiet hiss. Moments later, the rescue ship disengaged from the nightfall and disappeared into the endless void. For several minutes, Jackson remained standing in the silent docking bay. Then he looked down at the medallion resting in his palm. He laughed despite himself. Only a human could accidentally become the Empress's savior simply by falling asleep in the wrong place. He slipped the medallion into his pocket and made his way back through the abandoned frigate. The emergency lights still flickered. The life support systems still groaned. Nothing about the ship had changed. And yet, somehow, everything had. Somewhere beyond the stars, the Empress of the Valdorian Empire was alive because one ordinary human had chosen compassion over revenge. Perhaps that was how real peace began. Not through treaties, not through fleets, but through one impossible act of mercy between two former enemies. Jackson smiled to himself. "Humanity," he muttered. "Fuck yeah." And for the first time since the war had ended, the words felt less like a battle cry and more like hope.